The old hum was her only companion, the steady, thrumming resonance of the Vestige 7 station cycling air and power in the absolute stillness of the Tartarus Nebula. Dr. Eris Thorne preferred it to silence. Silence was a vacuum, and vacuums were always filled by memory. The hum was a constant, a low-frequency anchor that kept the ghosts at bay. For 10 years, the ghost of Elias Vance had been the most persistent. She saw him in the star-dusted velvet outside her observation window, in the flicker of a diagnostic panel, in the empty seat across from her in the mess hall. She had buried him a decade ago. A closed casket funeral with a flag folded so tight it looked like it might scream. An engine malfunction during a routine patrol near Io, they'd said. A clean, tragic, unremarkable end for a man who had been anything but. Eris had poured her grief into the one thing that made sense the past. She became a xenoarchaeolinguist, a scholar of dead words from dead worlds, because deciphering the sorrows of extinct civilizations felt infinitely more manageable than confronting her own. Here, on Vestige 7, she was the sole curator of a dead star's graveyard, sifting through the particulate ruins of a species that had turned to glass and dust a billion years before humanity had even learned to spark fire. Her work was quiet, methodical, and safe. It was a life built as a monument to a memory, and she had been content in her gilded cage of cosmic dust and forgotten grammar. The hum changed. It was a subtle shift, a discordant frequency weaving itself into the station's familiar drone. Eris froze, her hand hovering over a holographic shard of crystallized text. No ships were scheduled, no supply drops, no administrative check-ins. She was a forgotten asset in a forgotten sector, a rounding error in the Conclave's galactic budget. She moved to the main viewport, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. Outside, eclipsing the faint, ghostly light of the nebula, was a ship that did not belong. It was a knife of a vessel, all sharp angles and non-reflective plating, a design that absorbed light and hope with equal efficiency. A Conclave Inquisitor-class ship, the Stiletto. They didn't send Inquisitors to deliver supplies. They sent them to acquire assets or eliminate problems. A red light pulsed on her console, an incoming high-priority hail. She let it blink for a long moment, the color of a fresh wound against the cool blue of her lab. When she finally accepted the connection, the face that materialized was as severe and unyielding as the ship she commanded. Director Valerius had eyes that looked like they had been personally excavated from a glacier. Her face was a mask of cold pragmatism, unlined by emotion but etched with the faint, weary lines of impossible decisions. "Dr. Thorne," she began, her voice devoid of pleasantry. "By the authority of the Outer Rim's security mandate, you are being reactivated. Your research sabbatical is terminated. Pack a personal kit. We depart in 20 minutes. Eris felt a surge of defiance, the first truly hot emotion she had allowed herself in years. Reactivated. I am a civilian researcher. Director. My contract with the Conclave is academic, not military. And with all due respect, you have no authority in this sector." Valerius's expression did not change, but a flicker of something impatience perhaps tightened the corner of her lip. "Your civilian status is a temporary convenience, Doctor, as is my lack of official authority. The mandate supersedes both. The situation on the Perseus Arm has escalated." The Perseus Arm. Eris felt the blood drain from her face. That's where the whispers were coming from. Fragmented reports of entire colonies going dark, not with a bang, but with a terrifying collective silence. The silicates, Eris whispered. Valerius nodded. A single, sharp gesture. They are not invaders, not in the way we understand. They don't conquer worlds, they erase them. Their method of attack is resonant, a psychic frequency that shatters sentient consciousness. Entire populations are descending into catatonic madness, their minds simply unspooling. Our fleets are useless. You can't shoot a sound. You can't bomb a vibration that turns your own brain into a screaming labyrinth. She paused, letting the horror of it settle in the quiet station. We have lost 12 colonies, 1 billion minds silenced in a matter of months. We are not losing a war. Doctor, we are experiencing an extinction event. Aris gripped the edge of her console, the cold metal biting into her palms. What does any of this have to do with me? I translate dead languages. I study dust. For the first time, a shadow of something other than command crossed Valerius's face. It was a deep, profound weariness, the look of a person who had stared into the abyss for so long that she had forgotten the light. Because the silicates fear something, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There is one sector of space they will not enter. They skirt its edges like a herd of animals avoiding a predator's territory. We call it the silent zone. Nothing functions correctly there. Probes vanish. Long-range scans return only noise, a discordant, mournful chaos that our analysts have nicknamed the Dirge. Eris felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. The hum of her station was gone, replaced by a roaring in her ears. I don't understand, she stammered, though a part of her, a deep and terrified part, was already beginning to. Valerius's gaze was unblinking, merciless. 10 years ago, the Conclave authorized a project that was never meant to exist. Project Echo. It wasn't about faster-than-light travel in the conventional sense. It was about imprinting a human consciousness directly onto the fabric of space-time, allowing for instantaneous navigation, a pilot who could become the map. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the carefully constructed piece of Eris's last decade. The lead test pilot was the best we had, a man with an unparalleled intuitive grasp of spatial dynamics, a man named Elias Vance. Eris made a sound, a choked, wounded thing that was barely human. She stumbled back, hitting the viewport hard. The cold of space seemed to seep through the reinforced glass, chilling her to the bone. No, she breathed. He died. An engine malfunction. Valerius's face was now etched with a grim kind of pity. That was the official story. A necessary fiction. The experiment failed. Doctor, catastrophically. The device was meant to fold space. Instead, it tore it. We didn't lose the ship. We lost the pilot. His consciousness wasn't destroyed. It was smeared, unraveled across a dozen light years of space-time. He didn't die. Eris. He became the silent zone. He is the Dirge. The stiletto's tractor beam engaged with a shudder that shook the entire station, a physical manifestation of her world being torn from its foundations. Valerius's voice was the only steady thing in the chaos. The silicates are a hive mind, a consciousness bound by psychic resonance. Elias is the opposite. He is pure, chaotic, fractured consciousness, a psychic scream that never ends. To them, he is an anti-god, a force of pure entropy that they cannot comprehend. And Therefore, they fear him. He is the only weapon we have left that might work against them." Eris slid down the viewport to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself as the station groaned, being pulled inexorably toward the black ship. Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. The ghost she had lived with for 10 years was not a memory. It was a monster. Her husband was a haunted house the size of a solar system. "Why me?" she cried out, her voice raw with a decade of unshed grief now uncaged. "What do you want from me?" Director Valerius looked at her, and the cold mask of command was gone, replaced by the stark, ugly face of desperation. "We cannot control him. We cannot communicate with him. He is too broken, too vast. But you were his anchor once. Your voice, your memories, your shared language. You are the only one who might be able to reach the man inside the storm. We aren't asking you to translate a dead language. Dr. Thorne, we are asking you to speak to a ghost. We need you to aim your husband's soul at the heart of our enemy." Eris looked past the director's hologram, out the viewport, as her small, safe world was swallowed by the shadow of the stiletto. She was no longer a scholar. She was bait. They were going to weaponize her love, sharpen her grief into a key, and ask her to unlock a door into a hell she never knew existed. She closed her eyes, and all she could hear was the hum, no longer a comfort, but the promise of a discordant, universe-spanning scream that wore her husband's face. The transition from her life's work to a holding cell was a matter of meters and minutes. One moment, Eris was surrounded by the dusty, comforting ghosts of a long-dead civilization. The next, she was encased in the sterile, white-on-white anonymity of a cabin aboard the Stiletto. The room was an insult in its simplicity, a magnetic bunk, a small wash basin, and a data terminal that remained stubbornly inert. The steady, life-affirming hum of her station had been replaced by the ship's thrum, a deeper, more aggressive resonance that felt like a predator's purr. It was the sound of purpose, and Eris was now an unwilling component of its function. She sat on the edge of the bunk for what felt like hours, the director's words echoing in the pressurized silence. He didn't die. Eris. He became the silent zone. It was a truth so monstrous, so far beyond the scope of conventional grief, that her mind refused to grant it purchase. It was easier to believe she had gone mad, that this was some elaborate hallucination brought on by a decade of isolation. But the cold floor beneath her feet and the predatory hum in her bones were undeniably real. The door hissed open, and Director Valerius stepped inside, her presence sucking the scant warmth from the air. She held a data slate. "We are 2 days from the edge of the quarantine perimeter," she stated, forgoing any pretense of comfort. "You need to be prepared." Eris looked up, and the shock that had frozen her features had now thawed into a glacial rage. "Prepared for what to be a psychic lure, to dangle my memories in front of the monster you made out of my husband." Valerius's expression remained impassive. "I understand this is difficult." "You understand nothing," Eris snapped, rising to her feet. "You hid his death from me." "No, not his death, his vivisection. You took the kindest, most brilliant man I ever knew, and you tore his soul apart to make a shortcut across the galaxy. You didn't just kill him, you desecrated his memory. And now you have the audacity to come to me for help." Valerius didn't flinch from the tirade. She simply extended the data slate. "Look at it." Reluctantly, Eris took it. The screen lit up, displaying a star chart, 12 systems in the Perseus arm were marked with a blinking red icon that read, "Signal lost." Beside it was a waveform, a chaotic, jagged scribble of audio data labeled the dirge. "Play it," Valerius commanded. Aris tapped the screen. The sound that filled the small cabin was not merely noise. It was the auditory equivalent of a wound. It was a cacophony of shrieking static, the ghost of 1,000 radio channels talking at once, and beneath it all, a low, keening moan. It was the sound of a mind endlessly breaking, but as she listened, a cold dread trickled down her spine. Within the chaos, she could almost hear patterns, fragments, like a word trying to form in a hurricane of noise. It was the linguistic center of her brain, the part of her that searched for meaning in the meaningless, desperately trying to assemble syntax from the static. And in one fleeting, horrifying instant, she heard it. A single, impossibly distorted syllable that sounded like her name. Iris. She dropped the slate as if it had burned her. It clattered to the floor, the terrible sound still pouring from its speakers. "Make it stop," she whispered, her hands flying to her ears. Valerius calmly bent down, picked up the slate, and silenced it. "That is what he has been for 10 years, she said, her voice now softer, laced with the grim finality of a field surgeon. A conscious, unending agony. Project Echo was a failure, Doctor, but not in the way you think. The device worked. It connected him to space-time, but we failed to account for the sheer scale of it. A human mind isn't meant to perceive a dozen light years simultaneously. It wasn't built to feel the gravitational pull of a dying star and the radioactive decay of a distant moon at the same time. His senses shattered. His consciousness expanded until it shredded. What you hear is the echo of that moment, looping for a decade. "Why keep it a secret?" Eris asked, her voice trembling. "Pride, fear of reprisal. Survival," Valerius corrected. The conclave was on the verge of collapse. News of this, of turning a war hero into a cosmic horror, would have torn us apart. So we classified it. We built a wall of silence around his tomb and called it a quarantine zone. We hoped he would eventually fade, that his consciousness would dissipate into background radiation. We were wrong. He has remained a constant, screaming monument to our hubris. And now, that monument is the only thing standing between us and the silicates. Valerius led her from the cabin, down corridors that were as much circuits as hallways, the walls humming with palpable power. They arrived at a large, circular chamber at the heart of the ship. In the center stood a device that looked like a collaboration between a physician and a torturer. It was a chair, but it was surrounded by a halo of gleaming silver filaments and suspended within a sphere of interlocking rings that hummed with latent energy. A young, nervous-looking man in a technician's uniform, Kalen, was running diagnostics on a nearby console. "This is the mnemonic resonance emitter," Valerius explained. "Project Echo's sister. One was designed to send a mind out. This one was designed to call it back." Kalen looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "It's a psychic amplifier, Dr. Thorne," he stammered. "It won't just broadcast your voice. It will take a memory, a specific, emotionally charged memory from your mind and encode it onto a carrier wave. It translates sentiment into a signal. We believe a powerful, shared memory could act as a focusing lens, a familiar landmark in the chaos of his shattered psyche. It might be enough to cohere his consciousness, just for a moment. Eris stared at the machine, at the neurocradle that hung above the chair like a metal spider. They weren't asking her to talk to him. They were asking her to bleed her memories into the void, to turn the most precious, private moments of her life into a weapon. "You're going to rifle through my past and pick the most potent emotional catalyst," she said, her voice flat and dead. "You'll weaponize our wedding day, the birth of a child we never had, the last time I told him I loved him. We will use what is necessary," Valeria stated, her commander's mask firmly back in place. "The Conclave has compiled a complete file of your life together, every recorded message, every shared space, every piece of data that connected you to him." She gestured to Kalen, who reluctantly brought another data slate to Eris. This one was filled with her life. It was a library of her own heart. The days passed in a blur of forced remembrance. Eris sat in her sterile cabin, scrolling through ghosts. She watched a shaky recording of Elias on their honeymoon on the crystalline shores of Kepler 186f, his laugh echoing in the thin alien air as he tried to skip a flat, metallic stone across a sea of methane. She listened to a message he'd left her during a long deployment, his voice tired but warm, describing the colors of a nebula no human had ever seen before. "It's almost the color of your eyes after you've been reading all night. Ari, that kind of deep, quiet blue." Each memory was a fresh stab of grief, but now it was tainted, repurposed. These were no longer her treasures. They were ammunition. As the stiletto pushed deeper into space, closer to the Silent Zone's border, the ship began to change. It started with subtle glitches. Lights would flicker in empty corridors. The ship's internal chronometer would lose a second, then gain it back. Crew members spoke in hushed tones of fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, of hearing faint whispers that vanished when they turned their heads. The ship felt haunted. And Eris felt it most of all. It was a faint pressure at the back of her mind, a low-frequency thrum that resonated with her sorrow. It was him. A faint, distorted echo, like a radio signal from a world away. He was aware of their approach. Finally, the day came. The ship dropped out of FTL, and the view outside the main bridge was a panorama of wrongness. Space wasn't black here. It was bruised. The stars seemed to smear at the edges, their light bent and warped as if seen through a flawed, weeping lens. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the very hull of the stiletto, a physical counterpoint to the chaotic dirge that now flooded the comms channels. Valeria stood on the command deck, her face illuminated by the swirling madness on the view screen. "We've arrived. Doctor." Eris walked with a strange sense of calm toward the resonance chamber, Kalen and Valerius flanking her. The crew on the bridge averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. She was the sacrifice being led to the altar. Inside the chamber, the air was cold and smelled of ozone. Kalen avoided her gaze as he began the pre-activation sequence. "We've selected the memory," he said softly, "from your file, the day you met. The lecture on pre-galactic syntax at the University of Corinth. The resonance signature is incredibly strong." Eris closed her eyes, the memory surfacing unbidden. A dusty lecture hall, the smell of old books and rain, a young, confident pilot in the back row who had asked a question so insightful It had derailed her entire presentation and started a 2-hour debate that ended with coffee and the beginning of her life. She sat in the chair, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the memory. The halo of filaments began to glow. The interlocking rings spun slowly, building a low hum that harmonized with the greater, terrible hum of the silent zone. The neurocradle descended, its cold probes pressing against her temples. Through the plasteel observation window, she saw Valerius's stern, expectant face. She was no longer Eris Thorn, scholar, DeWidow. She was a key, about to be turned in the lock of a mad god's prison. Activating mnemonic bridge. Kalen's voice crackled over the intercom, his words tight with strain. Signal injection in 3, 2, 1. Eris didn't hear the rest. The hum of the machine faded. The hum of the ship vanished. The world dissolved, and in its place, a single, universe-spanning, and intimately familiar scream erupted inside her mind. It was the sound of Elias, and she was falling into him. The fall was not a physical sensation, but a psychic unraveling. Aris was stripped of form, of weight, of self, becoming a disembodied point of awareness plunging through a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated sensation. She saw the birth of a stare in a flash of blinding white that tasted of ozone and felt like a lover's touch. She felt the silent, grinding pressure of a black hole's event horizon. A weight so absolute it had a sound a low, resonant tolling of a final bell. Time was a braided river, flowing forwards and backwards simultaneously. She experienced a decade of Elias's solitude in a single, heart-stopping moment of absolute loneliness, and in the next, she was a child again, feeling the sun on her face on a world that had not yet been named. This was his prison, not a place, but a state of being, every nerve ending, every synapse, every quantum possibility of his consciousness stretched across the canvas of space-time. Screaming, the chaos fought her. It was a psychic immune system, and she was the invading pathogen. Waves of raw data crashed against her awareness, stellar classifications, decay rates of exotic particles, the faint, billion-year-old radio echo of a dead civilization's last broadcast. It was a library of the universe, and every book was open, its pages screaming for attention. Her own memories began to fray at the edges. The scent of the dusty lecture hall replaced by the metallic tang of cosmic radiation. She was dissolving, her identity being ground into the grit of his endless perception. But the machine, the mnemonic resonance emitter, held one memory in place. It was her anchor in the hurricane. With a final, desperate act of will, she clung to it, pulling the threads of her consciousness back together. The universal chaos receded, not vanishing, but pushed back to the edges of her perception. A roaring ocean held at bay by the fragile sea wall of her memory. The world solidified around her. She was standing in a lecture hall at the University of Corinth. The light was dusty, the air thick with the smell of old paper and rain-soaked coats. It was perfect. It was a flawless reconstruction, except for the walls. They weren't solid. They shimmered, and through their translucent surface, she could see the swirling, bruised light of the silent zone, the chaos still raging just beyond the confines of her sanctuary. And then she saw him. He was standing in the back row, just as he had been that day. But he was wrong. He was a fractured image, a projection made of static and sorrow. His form flickered, and in the spaces between the flickers, she saw glimpses of the void. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. "They don't stop," he whispered, his voice a distorted chorus of 1,000 echoes. "The signals, the angles are all wrong. The light is too old. The gravity, it pulls." He looked up, and his eyes were not the warm, intelligent eyes she remembered. They were windows into the storm, swirling with a pain so vast and ancient it made her soul ache. "Who are you?" the chorus of voices asked. "You're new. You're a new signal. You're too quiet, too clear." Back on the bridge of the Stiletto, the ship itself was screaming. Alarms blared as gravity plating fluctuated, sending loose objects drifting into the air before slamming them back down. The main view screen, showing the roiling chaos of the Silent Zone, now had a new feature, a dead calm spot at its very center, a perfect circle of absolute blackness, like the eye of a hurricane. "What's happening?" Valerius demanded, gripping a railing as the deck pitched beneath her. Kalen, his face pale and beaded with sweat, frantically worked his console. "The feedback is impossible. The energy draw from the ship's core is threatening a cascade failure. But the dirge... Director, look at the waveform." He pointed to a secondary screen. The jagged, chaotic scribble of Elias's consciousness was smoothing out. The noise was resolving itself into a single, impossibly powerful frequency. "He's not just a field of chaos anymore," Kalen breathed. "She's focusing him. He's becoming a coherent something. Dr. Thorne's biometrics are critical. Her neural activity is off the charts. We're going to lose her." "Hold the connection," Valerius commanded, her voice like ice. "She is the fulcrum. Do not let it break." Inside the memory, Aris took a step toward the fractured man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the roaring symphony of his pain. "Elias," she said, her own voice sounding thin and small. "It's me. It's Aris." The storm in his eyes intensified. Aris. The name echoed, spoken by a legion of ghosts. A sound. A memory fragment. Damaged data. "It hurts. That data hurts." "No, it's not data," she insisted, taking another step. "It's a memory. Our memory. This is the day we met. You were in the back, wearing your pilot's fatigues. You had a loose thread on your right cuff, and you kept pulling at it." The chaos in his form stilled for a fraction of a second. The chorus of voices faltered. A single, clear voice, the ghost of her husband's, spoke. "A thread. You asked me about the syntax of the Signian glyphs," she continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a stone laid for the foundation of their shared past. "You said their written language wasn't a record of the past, but a map of probable futures. You called it grammatical prophecy." The static around him lessened. The flickering slowed. For one perfect, heart-stopping second, the storm in his eyes cleared, and it was him. It was Elias. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the legion of voices condensed into one. "Ari," he breathed. The single word filled with a decade of confusion and pain suddenly finding its name. I can't. Where have I been?" Tears streamed down Eris's face. "I'm here now," she whispered. "I'm here." It was a moment of impossible reunion, a single point of clarity in a universe of madness. It was the most beautiful and painful moment of her life. And then Valerius gave the order. On the stiletto's bridge, she spoke a single cold command into her comm. Transmit the target coordinates. Inside the memory, the world shattered. A new signal, alien and sharp, pierced the fragile peace. It wasn't a sound or an image. It was a feeling. A psychic imperative of pure, predatory hunger. It burned through the lecture hall. A coordinate marker for a place of unimaginable psychic gravity, the silicate hive mind. Elias screamed, clutching his head as his form dissolved back into a vortex of static and light. The brief moment of coherence was gone, obliterated by this new, intrusive command. The storm returned, 100 times more powerful, but it was no longer aimless. It now had a direction, a target. You, he roared, the voice once again a legion, but this time it was not one of confusion, but of betrayal. You brought it. You are the signal, a new pain, a leash. The shimmering walls of the lecture hall cracked and fell away, and Aris was plunged back into the raw, unfiltered chaos of his mind. But she was no longer an observer. She was now linked to him, bound to the tip of the spear. She could feel the rage, the pain, the betrayal coiling into a single, focused point of annihilation. She was the lens, and through her, the shattered, godlike consciousness of Elias Vance was being aimed like a weapon across the galaxy. She tried to pull back, to sever the connection, but it was too late. She was part of him now, a sliver of sanity trapped in the heart of an avenging, heartbroken god. On the view screen of the stiletto, the black eye of the storm began to move. It elongated, stretched, and then shot across the bruised canvas of the silent zone, a lance of pure, focused rage, leaving a screaming silence in its wake. Valerius watched, her expression unreadable, as her weapon, forged from a man's soul and aimed by his wife's heart, flew toward its target. Aris was still inside, screaming, but in the cold, hard vacuum of command, no one could hear her. The journey was instantaneous and eternal. Aris was the arrowhead on a spear of pure thought, traveling not through space but through the folds of space-time itself. She was a conscious singularity, a point of focused intention inside the raging, weaponized grief of her husband. She felt the silicate hive mind before she saw it. It was a presence of crushing psychic gravity, a silent, monolithic consciousness that felt like a mountain made of a billion insects, all dreaming the same dream of cold, perfect order. It had no emotion, no individuality, only a vast, serene, and utterly alien purpose to absorb, to silence, to make everything part of its silent, perfect whole, as their focused consciousness. The dirge approached. The silicate's serenity fractured. Aris felt their first response a wave of pure, psychic negation. It was an attempt to simply unmake them, to declare them non-existent. It was the mental equivalent of a wall of fire, and against a normal mind, it would have been instantaneous annihilation. But Elias was not a normal mind. He was a wound in the universe, a being of pure, chaotic entropy. Trying to negate him was like trying to extinguish a black hole with a bucket of water. He did not break against the wall. He consumed it. Aris felt him feed on the psychic energy, his own chaotic power swelling. The silicate's attack only made him stronger. Inside the raging torrent of his mind, Aris fought for her own sanity. She was no longer in the memory of the lecture hall. She was in a space of pure metaphor, A stormy sea under a sky of screaming static. Elias was the storm itself, a vortex of dark water and lightning-laced clouds. And she was a tiny, battered ship, tossed on his waves, her own consciousness the only thing keeping her from being torn apart. "Elias!" "Stop!" she screamed into the wind, her voice a psychic projection, a thought form in the tempest. "They're using you. They're using us. This isn't you." A face formed in the churning clouds, a colossal effigy of his agony, its eyes burning with the light of dying stars. "They hurt you." The storm boomed, the voice a tectonic grinding of 1,000 echoes. "You were the signal, the anchor. They used you to put a hook in me. I will unmake them for it." He misunderstood. He thought the silicates had sent the targeting signal. He believed they were the source of this new, searing pain of betrayal, the ones who had tainted their most precious memory to turn him into a weapon. His rage was a shield, protecting what little was left of his fractured self. And that shield was now aimed at the wrong enemy. The silicate hive mind recoiled, a psychic ripple of what, in a lesser being, might be called shock. Their second wave of defense was more subtle. They opened themselves, not in welcome, but as a lure. They projected a vision of perfect, ordered tranquility, a universe without pain, without chaos, without grief, a silent, crystalline lattice where every consciousness was a perfect, harmonious note in an infinite, silent chord. They offered him peace. They offered him an end to the screaming. For a moment, Eris felt the storm around her quiet, the raging waves calm to a deep, troubled swell. She felt the temptation in him, the deep, soul-weary longing for an end to a decade of agony. He could simply let go, dissolve into their silent perfection, and finally be at rest. It was the most insidious weapon of all mercy. "Elias!" "No," Eris pleaded, her thought form reaching out to the colossal, brooding face in the clouds. "It's a lie. It's not peace. It's erasure. Don't let them take you from me again. They offer an end to the noise," he whispered, the storm receding. "There is no more pain there, only quiet. There's no you there, either," she cried. "Don't you see, that's what they do. They silence things that isn't who you are. You were never quiet. You were loud and brilliant, and you filled every room you were in. You pulled at the threads of the universe because you were curious. Don't let them make you a part of their silent tapestry." She pushed with all her might, not with anger, but with love. She projected her own memories into him, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Their laughter on Kepler 188F, his hand in hers as they watched the twin suns of Sirius set. The quiet, unspoken language of their shared life. It was like a matchstick in a hurricane, but it was enough. The memories, untainted by the conclave's machine, reached him. The storm roared back to life, but its character had changed. It was no longer a blind, wounded rage. It was a focused, righteous fury. "They lie," he thundered. "Their quiet is a cage." And then he struck. He did not attack the silicate's physical form, if they even had one. He attacked their very nature. He was a being of pure, chaotic, individual consciousness. They were a being of pure, ordered, collective consciousness. He turned himself into a psychic virus. He injected the one thing their perfect, ordered system could not tolerate: individuality. He didn't just project his own pain. He projected the concept of a singular self. He forced upon their billion minds as one the experience of being alone. He gave them memory. He gave them names. He gave them grief. Eris felt it happen. A psychic shockwave that was the opposite of an explosion. It was an implosion. The monolithic, mountain-like presence of the hive mind shattered into a billion screaming points of light, a billion individual minds, born in a single instant of catastrophic psychic trauma, suddenly aware of their own solitude, their own mortality, their own loss. They had been a single, perfect being. Now they were a chorus of orphans, weeping for a self they had just lost. The psychic scream of their collective birth and death was a wave of pure agony that washed back over Elias, and through him, Eris. It was the grief of a dying god, and it was nearly enough to shatter them both. On the bridge of the Stiletto, the crew watched in stunned silence. The silicate menace, the force that had silenced 12 worlds, had simply vanished. Every sensor, every psychic resonance detector that had been screaming with their presence just moments before, now registered nothing. The Perseus arm was silent, but it was no longer the chilling silence of the silicates. It was an empty, echoing silence of absence. Valerius allowed herself a single, sharp exhale. "Recall the asset," she commanded, her voice betraying a microscopic tremor of relief. "Kalen, bring them back." Kalen's hands flew across his console, but his face was a mask of growing panic. "Director, I can't. The connection is, it's not a bridge anymore. It's a bond." When he struck the hive mind, the psychic backlash fused them. "I can't sever the link from our end. She's part of him now." Valerius's face hardened. The brief flicker of relief extinguished. She had aimed her weapon, and it had fired perfectly, but now she could not put it back in its holster. The storm in Eris's mind was gone, replaced by a profound and terrible quiet. The psychic echo of a billion minds dying had scoured Elias's consciousness clean. He was no longer a raging tempest. He was a deep, dark, silent ocean. The roaring was gone, but so was the light. She floated in a calm, black void, and she was alone. The link to the stiletto was a faint, silvery thread in the distance, a lifeline she could no longer reach. And then, a new presence emerged from the depths. It was Elias, but not as she had known him. He was whole. He was coherent. The fractures were gone. The static was gone. The legion of voices was gone. He stood before her, a perfect, luminous being of pure thought, his form no longer distorted by pain, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying, absolute clarity. He had been a fractured god. Now, he was a whole one. "Eris," he said, his voice a single, perfect, and chillingly calm tone. "I see now. It wasn't them. The hook, the leash. It was the conclave. It was her." He looked past Eris, his gaze piercing through the psychic veil, through the light years of empty space, seeing the stiletto, seeing the bridge, seeing the unyielding face of Director Valerius. He had mistaken the silicates for his jailers. Now he knew who had truly forged his chains. They pointed a gun at an entire species, he said, his voice resonating with a cold, cosmic authority. And they pulled the trigger. They used your love as ammunition, and my soul as the bullet. He turned his gaze back to her, and, for the first time, she felt a sliver of true fear. His love for her had been the anchor that saved him. But now that love was intertwined with an ultimate sense of betrayal. "Thank you, Ari," he said softly, his thought form reaching out to touch her cheek. "You gave me back my mind." A silent, terrible beat passed. "Now," he said, his eyes beginning to glow with a cold, white light, "I am going to use it." The cold, white light of Elias's consciousness did not travel through space. It simply arrived. One moment, the bridge of the stiletto was a scene of controlled panic. The next, it was a tomb. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the command deck into a profound darkness, pierced only by the swirling, bruised light of the silent zone on the main view screen. Every console went dark. Every system fell silent. The aggressive, predatory hum of the ship's engines vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. They were adrift, a dead ship in a dead sector. And they were not alone. A single console flickered to life, not with data, but with a face. Aris's face, pale and tear-streaked, projected in ghostly light, but her eyes were not her own. They burned with the cold, white, terrifying clarity of her husband's newfound mind. Through her image, his voice spoke. It was not a sound transmitted through speakers, but a thought that bloomed directly in the minds of every person on the bridge. It was calm, precise, and carried the weight of a dying star. Director Valerius. Valerius stood her ground, her face a chiseled mask of defiance, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the command rail. Vance she acknowledged, her own voice sounding thin and brittle in the crushing silence. The mission was a success. The silicate threat is neutralized. The ghostly image of Eris tilted its head, a gesture of cold curiosity. Mission. You call this a mission. You call the vivisection of a man's soul, the weaponization of his wife's love, a success. The pressure in the room intensified. The crew members felt a strange tingling at the base of their skulls, the precursor to a migraine of cosmic proportions. They were in the presence of a mind so powerful it was warping the very fabric of their perceptions. It was a necessity, Valerius countered, her voice low and steady, the voice of a commander who had made her peace with damnation long ago. 1 billion lives were silenced. 1 billion more were at risk. I sacrificed one man to save our species. I would make the same choice again. History will not judge me for the tools I used, only for the victory I secured. Eris, the real Eris, felt a wave of nausea. She was a passenger in her own body, a ghost in the machine of her husband's will. She could feel his cold, righteous fury, and, beneath it, a sorrow so deep it had no bottom. He was not just angry at Valerius. He was heartbroken for a humanity that could produce her. He was mourning the species that could build such a monstrous logic and call it salvation. She tried to fight him, to scream, to tell him that this cold, absolute justice was not the answer. But her will was a candle flame in his hurricane. History. Elias's voice mused, the word echoing with the weight of a being who now perceived all of it at once. History is a story told by the powerful to justify the suffering of the weak. But I am not a part of your history anymore. Director, I am a consequence. And consequences do not write stories. They deliver verdicts. The ghostly image of Eris faded from the screen, and the entire bridge lit up. Every console, every data slate, Every reflective surface simultaneously displayed a single, live feed the face of Director Valerius. But it wasn't just her face. It was her life. A torrent of data began to pour into the minds of the crew classified files, redacted orders, private conversations. They saw her authorizing Project Echo, signing off on the fabricated report of Elias's death. They heard her cold, pragmatic arguments for using Eris as a psychic lure. They witnessed every cold calculation, every necessary fiction, every soul-crushing compromise made in the name of the greater good. It was not an accusation. It was a complete, unfiltered, and damning confession, broadcast directly from her own memory. Valerius staggered back, her hand flying to her temple as if to stop the psychic intrusion. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "You built my prison out of secrets and lies." Elias's voice resonated, now imbued with a terrible, rising power. "I am returning the favor. You will have no more shadows to hide in." The broadcast was not limited to the stiletto. Across the conclave, on every military channel, every government server, every public news feed, the truth of Project Echo erupted. The story of Elias Vance, the hero turned cosmic horror, the tale of his ghost in the machine, and the cold. Hard proof of the conspiracy that created him was laid bare for the entire species to see. The conclave's authority, built on a foundation of carefully curated lies, crumbled in a matter of minutes. But it wasn't enough for Valerius, and for the inner circle of the conclave who had sanctioned the project. Elias reserved a more personal judgment. "You cannot understand what you did to me," his voice whispered into their minds alone. "But you will." He did not kill them. He did something far more terrible. He gave them a gift. He opened a channel, a pinprick in their consciousness, and poured a single, condensed second of his 10 years of agony into their minds. It was not the full, maddening chaos. It was a single, perfect, crystalline drop of pure despair, the feeling of being unmade, the sound of a mind endlessly breaking, the infinite loneliness of a soul smeared across the stars. For one unbearable second, they knew what it was to be him. On the bridge, Valerius crumpled to the floor. She didn't scream. The sound that escaped her lips was a thin, broken whimper. Her eyes, once as cold and sharp as glaciers, were now wide, vacant, and shattered, reflecting a horror that no human mind was ever meant to contain. She was alive. She was physically unharmed, but the arrogant, pragmatic director was gone forever, replaced by a hollow shell, haunted by a glimpse into an eternity of pain she herself had created. The conclave did not fall to a fleet of warships. It fell to a single, shared memory. With the verdict delivered, the pressure on the stiletto lifted. The lights flickered back on. The hum of the engines returned, and the ship was once again a machine, no longer a vessel for a god's wrath. But in the psychic void where Eris and Elias were joined, the final act was playing out. The cold, white light of his anger faded, leaving behind the deep, quiet, and now peaceful darkness. He had not sought revenge. He had sought justice, a rebalancing of the universal equation. And now it was done. He turned his full, undivided attention to her, the anchor of his sanity, the cause of his torment, the love of his fractured life. Iris, he projected, his thought form now just a warm, familiar presence in the void. It's over. She could feel the silvery thread connecting her back to the mnemonic emitter, back to her body in the chair. She could go back. She could wake up, a hero of a war she never wanted to fight, and live out her days in a world that now knew the truth. She could return to her quiet life of dust and dead languages. But she knew that the silence would be deeper now, the ghosts more real. "Will you stay like this?" she asked, her own thought a whisper in their shared space. "Will you drift forever? I am no longer the dirge," he replied. "But I can never be just a man again. This is what I am now, a consciousness bound to the quiet places between the stars." A profound choice settled upon her, a choice no one had ever had to make: to return to a life without him, or to embrace a death that was not an end, but a transformation. Her love had been used to aim him. Now, her love would be the thing that gave him peace. "I'm not leaving you again," she whispered, not with her mind, but with her soul. And with that final, resolute choice, she reached out and severed the silvery cord herself. On the stiletto, Kaelin cried out, "Director Dr. Thorne's life signs. They're gone." But Eris wasn't gone. She had simply let go. Her body in the resonance chair slumped, lifeless. But her consciousness, now untethered, soared free. It rushed into the loving, waiting void of her husband's mind, and they merged, not as a collision, but as two rivers meeting to form an ocean. They were no longer Elias and Eris. They were something new, a dual consciousness, a perfect synthesis of his cosmic awareness and her deep human empathy. The chaos and the anchor had become one. They did not stay. They had no place in a galaxy of fragile, lying, and now recovering humans. Together, they turned their combined will outward, toward the deep, unexplored voids between the galaxies. They simply left. Humanity, in the years that followed, was forced to rebuild itself, not from the ashes of war, but from the rubble of a shattered truth. The conclave was dismantled, its leaders living out their days in silent, haunted asylums. A new government was formed, one founded on a principle of radical transparency, forever haunted by the specter of what secrets could create. The silent zone remained, but its nature changed. The chaotic, mournful dirge was gone. Now, probes that ventured near its edge reported a new signal, a soft, gentle, and impossibly complex hum, like a deep and contented sigh. They called it the Thorne-Vance Anomaly, a place of quiet wonder, a testament to a love that had outlived death, broken a god, and then healed him. It was a scar on the map of the galaxy, a reminder of humanity's greatest sin and its most profound and unintended act of creation. And in the silent, star-dusted places, the two of them drifted on, no longer a ghost and a scholar, but a single, silent, and finally peaceful hum in the vast, quiet dark.